David, thanks so much for making time to be with us here today.
Pleasure to be here.
Your thinking has impacted, I think, a lot of folks who will be gathered here today. One of the themes that sort of energizes this group and this conference, the Q Conference, is pursuing ideas for the common good. But it strikes me that in some ways the common good is under a bit of threat in our current moment, in our current zeitgeist. And you've talked about some of that yourself. You've talked about Charles Murray's book, Coming Apart. I think there's increasing fear that we're retreating into these enclaves and special interests. I wonder, what do you think is the hope for not coming apart? How can we, what are the prospects for the common good?
Right. Well, I guess I'd say there is hope, and I'd say it's on a couple levels. First, there's just the common nature of our humanity, that we all have certain traits in common. And I think over the last couple of years, there was an assumption about 10, 15, 20 years ago, universal assumption that we were blank slates, that we made ourselves depending on how we wanted to. And I think that has pretty much been discredited. There are certain things we all share, certain weaknesses. We all have a confirmation bias, a tendency to pick out the evidence that makes us feel good. But we also have certain strengths, certain intuitive strengths. And we all have a deep interpersonal connection with each other. One of the conclusions of the recent research on neuroscience is that we have these things in our heads called mirror neurons, which means we deeply imitate each other. We don't only see each other, we replicate in our own minds what we see each other's doing. So that really strengthens the natural power of any human community. The second thing is culture and history. You know, my family, well, part of my family, most of my family wasn't here in the 1830s when Alexis de Tocqueville came here. But the country he described is still essentially the country we live in. And so those common historical threads mean that even while we fight, if you go abroad, you realize, well, I'm still an American. And at times of trauma like 9/11, we still tend to snap together and unify. And so those common themes, both the human and cultural, historical, still there, and still give us a lot of commonality.
Do you think, some people would want to suggest that religious visions and religious voices kind of contribute to our coming apart? Do you think there's any way to see religious communities as part of that culture building that could actually foster the common good?
Yeah. First of all, I don't believe that. I think what defines us in America is a certain religiosity, no matter how secular or atheist some people may be. Europeans came to this country hundreds of years ago, and they saw the incredible abundance of the land. And they had two thoughts. One, that God's creation could be completed here. And the second was that they get really rich in the process. and so that gave them a moral materialism, an eschatology, a vision of how history would end. And that moral materialism still drives us. That's why Americans move so much, why we're so energetic. It's why we have fights over abortion and things like that, the way other countries don't. It's why we're still very religious, even though we're very affluent. It's why we have stores like Ben & Jerry's ice cream, stores that try to take material things and make them moral. And so that distinguishes us. And so that religiosity for everybody, even if they don't think they're religious, their minds are shaped by that history of religiosity. And I do think it still is basically a binding force for us.
Yeah. This conference is going to gather a lot of, especially I think, a younger generation of folks who are really passionate about cultural change, building culture. I wonder what your thoughts are about how cultural change happens, because it seems like in the social animal there could be a little bit of a chicken and egg question, which is, on the one hand, you need these agents who are passionately pursuing that. On the other hand, it seems like to get such agents of cultural change, you need an ethos, a culture, a community that is building them and fostering them. So I wonder where does one start? Or is it bottom up? Is it top down? Are we being naive to think we can change culture? Have you thought much about that?
Yeah, no, cultural change happens, but it happens slowly and unpredictably. And so, I guess the first thing to be said is that it is what drives history. I cover politics. We're in Washington right now. But Tom Wolfe was once asked, what's the most important thing that happened in your lifetime? And he said, oh, that's easy, co-ed dorms. And what he meant by that was that in 1950, co-ed dorms would have been unimaginable at any university in the country. And now at many universities, they're just normal. And so
am Charlotte Simmons, right?
Yeah, that's a pretty big change that nobody planned, it just happened. And so how does that change happen? I'd say it happens first in small cells. That you get a group of people, one person, then a group, and then that group creates other cells, and then the cells just multiply. And some cells never go anywhere. Most cells, it's like entrepreneurial activity. It just never goes anywhere. But some cells really do go anywhere. I'm reading a book right now about Dorothy Day, the Catholic social worker, really, in the 20th century. And she started a magazine, Catholic Worker. It was just her at one point. And you know, she took some wrong turns. I think she was pacifist during World War II, but that was consistent with her view of life. But she really created a movement by living an example.
Yeah.
And what was interesting about her was it wasn't only a newspaper. It was also a boarding house for the poor. It was farms. It was a soup kitchen. She did everything, all venues that would create community, and she did them all. And so then, you know, that's a model of how change happens.
Yeah. The Dorothy Day example is so interesting because on the one hand, she's building these Catholic worker houses, and it's a bit of a cell-like movement. On the other hand, there's the weight of an institution there that she's drawing on, a tradition. I wonder, you're something of a Burkean conservative, so you have this reverence for institutions, which has taught me a lot, actually. I wonder if you ever worry about a rising generation sort of repeating boomer antipathy to institutions, or do you see a difference maybe in a new generation's relationship to institutions?
I think it's a problem. I think a lot of people have been taught, think for yourselves, come up with your morality. And if your name is Aristotle, maybe you can do that.
Yeah.
But if your name isn't, probably can't. And so I think the smarter thing to do, you might not feel at home in the dominant culture, but find a counterculture, find a counter tradition. There are many institutions out there and many traditions out there. Find one that feels right to you just by experiment, finding one that feels right. And that won't determine your thinking in lockstep, but it'll give you a frame. A lot of people who are smarter than you, working over centuries to fill in a tradition.
Yeah.
And so I really think it's a big mistake to think you can do this on your own.
Yeah.
You need a tradition, and find who you feel comfortable with.
You spend a lot of time here in Washington. You report on politics. You see behind the curtain a lot. And even, it seems to me personally, you don't quite fit neatly and tidily into any ideology or current camp. And yet you don't seem cynical.
Yeah.
So I wonder, I think a lot of folks who are gathered here are part of this conversation also find themselves kind of falling between the cracks, or at least not comfortable in any sort of camp or party. I wonder, how do you foster hope when you're not part of a big choir?
Right. Well, first of all, you do have those traditions. I'm not a dominant Republican or Democrat right now, but I do feel I'm part of traditions. I'm part of that Edmund Burke tradition, and I'm part of an Alexander Hamilton tradition. And so I feel I'm part of something historical that has a long historical flow that will, even if my style is a little out of phase right now, I feel confident it will come back someday. And then the second thing to be said is I do cover politics very closely. I interview politicians every single day. And I would say they're better than our system. So if you spend a lot of time with them, you get uplifted because they're actually decent people. They're usually in it for the right reason. They're caught in a pretty miserable system right now. But that doesn't mean they themselves are venal or miserable. They're trying their best within the system that exists around them. And so that actually, I find the people who are away from politics, who just sort of look at it on cable TV, are more cynical than the people who are actually in the middle of it, who many of them are doing remarkable work for the right reason.
Interesting. So sometimes our kind of distant observer mentality fosters cynicism more than being in the muck and the mess of it, where you get the stories and the relationships that embody that.
Yeah, my shorthand answer is that the media is more cynical than the politicians, and the voters are more cynical than the media. But if you go we're sitting here on Constitution Avenue, all around us federal workers, and I'm not a huge fan of the federal government, I'm more conservative, but you go into those buildings, as I have, you sit in the meetings. We would never cover it in the media, it's just too boring. But the people are very high quality. They're not getting paid a lot of money. They're really committed to public service. And, that's the real stuff of government.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much for making time to talk with us, Tim. Really
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Thanks.